everything up! No, please, I didn't mean to.
It was supposed to be the happiest night of my life, my birthday, in our mansion filled with laughter and lights. But when his ex walked in and ripped my dress off in front of hundreds, no one expected what my husband would do next. If you've ever been humiliated and thought you'd never rise again, watch till the end. This story will remind you that karma always comes dressed in silence. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe dignity is stronger than revenge. They say some dreams are too big for people like me, but I never believed that. I wasn't born into luxury or legacy. My life used to be quiet and simple. Morning bus rides, secondhand dresses, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee in my tiny apartment. I didn't have much, but I had peace. Then I met Adrian Sterling, the man who would change everything. I still remember the first time I saw him. It wasn't in a fairy tale setting, just a crowded charity event where I was volunteering as an assistant. He walked in with a calm power that made the whole room adjust to his presence. People whispered his name like he was some untouchable legend, a self-made billionaire with an empire built on innovation and grace. But when he spoke to me, his tone wasn't heavy or grand. It was gentle. "You seem like the only person here who isn't pretending," he said with a smile that felt disarmingly honest. From that moment, something between us shifted. Slowly at first, then all at once. He wasn't the type to chase attention, and I wasn't the kind to crave wealth. Yet we met somewhere in the middle where sincerity and strength quietly fall in love. Within a year, I found myself in a world I never imagined, a marble mansion overlooking the ocean, servants who greeted me with perfect posture, and a man who made me feel like I belonged even when I didn't believe it myself. Adrian never flaunted his power, but you could feel it in every word he spoke. People respected him not because he was rich, but because he was steady. The kind of man who never raised his voice yet always commanded silence. I admired that about him, maybe even envied it. But being his wife wasn't as effortless as it looked from the outside. Behind the luxury, there were eyes watching me, judging, whispering, comparing. To them, I was the girl who didn't fit in the picture. I was the one who didn't know which fork to use at dinner, who laughed too genuinely, who didn't hide her emotions like the rest of them. Still, Adrian always reassured me. "You're the only real thing in my world, Eleanor," he'd say, brushing his thumb across my cheek as if grounding me back into place. And I believed him. His love made the coldest halls of our mansion feel warm. That's why, when he said he wanted to throw me a birthday gala, I smiled even though the thought made me nervous. He said it was time everyone saw me as his equal, not just as the woman he married, but as the woman he admired. The week leading up to that night was a blur of excitement and disbelief. The staff decorated the mansion with crystal chandeliers, silk drapes, and 1,000 white lilies that filled the air with sweetness. Every luxury brand wanted to dress me, but I chose something simple, a soft peach gown that felt like me, graceful but understated. When I saw my reflection, I thought, maybe this is what belonging feels like. Yet beneath the excitement, a small, unexplainable fear tugged at me. I'd heard Adrian's ex, Veronica Hale, was back in town, a woman everyone described as magnetic and ruthless. She had once been the queen of his world, and I could tell by the way people spoke her name that she wasn't used to losing. I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself she'd moved on, that she wouldn't dare appear in his life again. But something inside me whispered otherwise. That night, as I watched the mansion transform into a glowing palace for the celebration, I couldn't help but feel proud, and a little exposed. The ocean wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the staff preparing outside, and for a brief moment, I closed my eyes and let myself believe the fairy tale was real. I had everything I once prayed for: love, comfort, and belonging. But deep down, I didn't know that the storm was already forming, quiet, invisible, and waiting for its cue to strike. Because sometimes the most beautiful nights are the ones that end in chaos, and mine was just about to begin. The evening of the gala felt like a dream I didn't want to wake from. The mansion shimmered under thousands of golden lights, and the sound of violins danced through the marble halls. I could hear laughter, glasses clinking, and the low hum of expensive conversations, the kind that sounded elegant but always carried judgment. Still, I smiled through it all. It was my birthday, and Adrian had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it unforgettable. He appeared beside me at the top of the grand staircase, wearing a crisp white tuxedo that made him look impossibly regal. "Ready, my love?" he asked. I nodded, taking his arm as the crowd below turned to watch us descend. For a moment, I felt like I was gliding, not walking, through a world that had once felt out of reach. The guests applauded softly, some out of politeness, others out of envy. I saw flashes of admiration, curiosity, and maybe even disapproval. But none of it mattered because Adrian's hand was steady around mine. Every detail of the night carried his touch. The ballroom was draped in ivory silk and illuminated by chandeliers that reflected like stars. Tables overflowed with crystal glasses, exotic flowers, and desserts that looked too perfect to eat. The air smelled of roses and champagne. A famous jazz band played softly, and the guests, senators, CEOs, and socialites, moved through the space as if it were a scene from an old movie. Adrian leaned close and whispered, "Do you see what happens when grace meets greatness?" His words made me blush, not because of the attention but because of the pride in his eyes. I wanted to live in that moment forever, surrounded by light, love, and laughter that felt pure. But even as I greeted guests and accepted compliments, I noticed the occasional sideways glance. A few women whispered behind their fans, their smiles tight, their eyes sharp. I'd grown used to that kind of attention, the subtle disbelief that someone like me could belong in a place like this. Still, I kept my poise. I smiled, thanked them, and moved on. I refused to let anyone shrink my joy. Then, something changed. I heard the faint click of high heels echoing from the far end of the hall. It wasn't unusual. This house was full of guests, but there was something deliberate, even dramatic, in that sound. As I turned, the crowd seemed to part on its own. There she was, Veronica Hale. Every conversation stopped as she walked in, uninvited and unapologetic, draped in a crimson gown that glittered under the chandeliers. She looked like a fire set loose in a room of calm. Her beauty was undeniable, but so was the arrogance in her smile. Her eyes found mine immediately, not with curiosity, but with challenge. The whispers began. "Is that her? She actually came? How bold." My breath caught in my chest. I forced myself to stay composed. Adrian hadn't seen her yet. He was across the room talking to a senator, but I could feel the tension spreading like wildfire. Veronica glided through the crowd, greeting people she knew, pretending not to notice me. But every step she took felt calculated, like she was staging a scene only she understood. When she finally reached me, she leaned in with a sugary smile. "Eleanor," she said sweetly, "you look adorable. I almost didn't recognize you." Her words stung, but I kept my voice calm. "Thank you, Veronica. I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Oh, I wouldn't miss it," she said, tilting her head. "After all, it's not every day the whole city gathers to celebrate a fairy tale." Her tone dripped with irony. People nearby began pretending to check their phones or sip their drinks, anything to avoid the awkwardness building between us. But she didn't stop. "That gown, it's so modest. I suppose that's your charm." I smiled faintly. "I believe elegance doesn't need to scream to be noticed." Her eyes narrowed. For a moment, silence stretched like a wire between us. Then she laughed, too loudly, and patted my arm. "How precious," she said before turning to greet the people around us, her voice bright but her intention cruel. I tried to ignore her after that, to focus on my guests, but she made it impossible. Every time I moved, she appeared nearby, whispering, smirking, reminding me that I was still the outsider she couldn't stand to see win. By the time the cake was rolled out and everyone gathered around the table, my nerves were raw. I took a deep breath, smiled for the cameras, and tried to steady my hands. I didn't know that in just a few minutes, that same hall filled with laughter and light would fall into stunned silence, because the woman who had once lost everything to pride was about to try and take my dignity in front of everyone, and that, I would soon learn, was her final mistake. The candles on the cake flickered like tiny stars, their light dancing across the polished marble floor. The room smelled of champagne, roses, and candle wax. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, some warm, some watchful. The band played a soft melody, and Adrian, standing at a distance, raised his glass toward me with a proud smile. For a moment it felt like everything I had ever dreamed of was real. The love, the home, the life I thought I'd never deserve. But then the moment shattered. As I leaned forward to blow out the candles, Veronica's voice cut through the music like a blade. "Wait," she said loudly, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. The band fell silent. I froze, confused. She stepped closer, her heels tapping rhythmically against the marble as the crowd parted for her. "Before you make your wish, dear," she said, her lips curling, "I have a little surprise for you." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. I looked at her, trying to understand what she was doing. "Veronica, I think that's enough," I said softly, but she ignored me. Her smile widened, cruel, deliberate. "Oh, I just wanted to check something," she said, circling me like a predator eyeing its prey. "This dress? It's lovely. But tell me, darling, is it even real silk? Or just one of those affordable imitations?" Her words were sharp enough to draw blood. People began whispering. Phones lifted subtly. I felt heat rising to my cheeks, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. "Please step back," I said, steady but trembling inside. And then, before I could move, she reached out. With one swift, vicious tug, she ripped the back of my gown. A loud tear echoed through the hall. Gasps exploded from every corner. My body went cold as the silk tore down my back, exposing my skin to the glittering lights and staring eyes. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I heard someone stifle a laugh. Someone else whisper, "Oh my God!" The sound of a few people laughing, softly, nervously, and hit me harder than the act itself. My heart pounded in my ears. I stood frozen, my body trembling, my dignity slipping away thread by thread. Veronica laughed, tossing her hair as if she'd just told a clever joke. "Oh dear," she said mockingly, "it must have been cheaper than it looked." I wanted to disappear. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. My hands shook as I tried to hold the torn fabric together, to hide what she had done. I could hear cameras clicking. I could feel the humiliation like fire crawling up my spine. For a moment, I thought no one would do anything. Adrian was across the hall, still surrounded by guests and business partners, unaware of the scene unfolding. I felt completely alone, a fragile, broken thing in a room full of predators. But then I saw him. Adrian had stopped mid-conversation. His smile was gone. His gaze locked on me, on my trembling hands, on the rip in my gown, on Veronica's smirk. And in that moment, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fury. Not loud or wild, but cold, controlled, and absolute. He began to move, slowly, deliberately, through the crowd. Conversations died as he passed. The air shifted. Even Veronica, who had been laughing seconds ago, seemed to sense the change. He stopped in front of me, silent. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then, without a word, he took off his tuxedo jacket and wrapped it around me, his hands steady and protective. His voice, calm but razor-sharp, filled the hall. "Who did this?" No one spoke. The crowd stood frozen, waiting for what would happen next. Veronica tried to smile, but her voice wavered. "It was just a joke." Adrian turned his head slightly toward her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "A joke?" he repeated quietly. "You think tearing my wife's dress off her body in front of hundreds of people is a joke?" Her lips parted, but no words came. I clutched his jacket tightly, my heart racing, the shame slowly melting into something else, something fierce and new. For the first time that night, I realized I wasn't the one trembling anymore. Veronica was. Adrian's jaw tightened. His silence was louder than any shout could have been. The man everyone admired for his composure had finally reached his limit. And though he didn't raise his voice, his presence alone made the walls shake. At that moment, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. The night wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the storm Veronica had tried to unleash on me was about to turn on her. The silence that followed was so deep, it almost had a weight. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears as Adrian stood beside me, his jacket draped over my shoulders like a shield. His expression didn't change. No shouting, no theatrics, just a chilling calm that made everyone uneasy. The same guests who had been whispering moments ago now stood motionless, unsure of what would happen next. Adrian's hand found mine. His touch was steady, grounding me in a world that had just spun out of control. He didn't look at me. He was looking at Veronica, and the quiet rage in his eyes was enough to make even the most confident people in that room step back. "Veronica Hale," he said finally, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the air. "You've crossed the line." She laughed nervously, trying to play it off. "Oh, come on, Adrian," she said, lifting her chin. "It was a harmless prank." She knows how these parties are. Everyone teases a little. He didn't blink. "A prank is spilling champagne," he replied coldly. "What you did was assault and humiliation." The word humiliation hung between them like thunder. Veronica's smirk faltered. She looked around as if expecting someone to rescue her, but no one moved. Even the waiters stood frozen, unsure whether to clear glasses or stand as witnesses to history. Adrian turned away briefly, just long enough to take a deep breath, then stepped toward the microphone on the small stage beside the grand piano. His calm was terrifying. When he spoke again, his tone was even, but each word carried the force of authority that had built his empire. "I want everyone here to remember this moment," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, "because this is what happens when someone mistakes silence for weakness." All eyes were on him. I felt my pulse steady, my shame slowly dissolving into something else. Awe. He gestured toward Veronica. This woman tried to destroy another person's dignity for amusement. In my house, on my wife's birthday. She thought she could embarrass someone who's never wronged her and walk away untouched, but dignity isn't something you can steal, and respect isn't something you can fake. Veronica's face turned pale. "Adrian, please." But he continued, voice unshaken. "Effective immediately. Every contract your firm holds with Sterling Enterprises is terminated. Your sponsorships, your ambassador roles, gone. I've already sent word to our legal division." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The photographers who had once been capturing luxury now captured downfall. Veronica's confidence cracked. She reached out helplessly. "You can't do that!" He turned back to her, eyes burning with an icy finality. "You walked into my home and tried to undress my wife in front of my guests. You already did it to yourself." For a long, stunned second, the only sound was the clinking of a glass somewhere in the distance. Veronica's composure broke. She tried to protest again, but her voice came out uneven, desperate. Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he nodded to security. "Escort Miss Hale out, and make sure she never receives another invitation to any event under my name." The guards approached, gentle but firm. Veronica looked around for sympathy, but found none. Even the guests who had once admired her couldn't meet her eyes. She muttered something under her breath and stormed out, her heels echoing like a retreating drumbeat of defeat. As the doors closed behind her, Adrian turned back to me. He didn't speak right away, just reached for my trembling hand and held it tightly. The crowd watched in silence, some with guilt, others with admiration. He lifted my chin gently. "You did nothing wrong," he said softly. "You don't owe anyone shame." Then, before everyone, he placed his arm around me and guided me toward the center of the hall. He looked at the band and gave a single nod. Music swelled again, soft, graceful, deliberate, and in front of everyone who had just witnessed my humiliation, he took my hand and began to dance, slowly, tenderly, protectively. As we moved together beneath the chandeliers, people began to applaud, first quietly, then louder, until the entire hall filled with clapping. Cameras flashed, but this time not to capture scandal. They captured defiance. They captured strength. When Adrian whispered, "They can laugh, they can whisper, but they'll never break what we've built," I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. That night, I learned something I'd never forget. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it wears a tuxedo, holds your hand, and lets the whole world see what grace looks like when it finally stands tall. The night after the gala felt unreal. My phone buzzed endlessly with notifications, headlines, photos, and whispers spreading across the internet like wildfire. Model humiliates billionaire's wife and loses everything. Adrian Sterling defends wife in dignified show of power. Those were the words painted across every news outlet. People I had never met were suddenly calling me an icon of grace. But all I could think about was how heavy my heart felt. Yes, Veronica had been humiliated, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, drained by the noise, the lights, the flashes that had burned that moment into the world's memory. I didn't want to be remembered for a scandal. I wanted to be remembered for surviving it. The next morning, the mansion was quiet again. The scent of lilies still lingered in the air, though they felt like ghosts of the night before. Adrian was already awake, sitting by the glass window that overlooked the ocean. His posture was relaxed, but I could see the weight in his eyes. He looked at me as I entered, his expression softening. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "Barely," I admitted. "You?" He smiled faintly. "Not a second." I kept thinking how many people probably saw those pictures before the night even ended. I sighed, sitting beside him. They'll move on soon enough. Scandal is a short-lived addiction. He reached for my hand. "I didn't defend you to make headlines, Eleanor. I did it because I failed you first. I should have been by your side when it happened." I shook my head, my voice gentle. "You can't control every storm, Adrian. You just showed me what true strength looks like, calm in the middle of chaos." He looked at me quietly, then said something that made my chest tighten. "The moment I saw her lay a hand on you, I realized that power means nothing if it can't protect what truly matters." His words hung in the air like a promise. For the first time since that night, I smiled, not out of relief, but out of understanding. We had both learned something painful yet profound, that dignity and love don't scream for attention. They speak in actions. Later that week, invitations poured in, charity events, interviews, brand collaborations, all wanting to capitalize on the drama. I turned them all down. I wasn't interested in fame built from humiliation. What I wanted was healing, peace, and the quiet kind of redemption that doesn't need a camera to prove it. Adrian respected that. One evening, he surprised me with something far more meaningful than the gala. He led me to the garden behind the mansion, where candles flickered beneath a canopy of stars. The ocean murmured softly in the distance. "This," he said, wrapping his arm around me, "is how I want to celebrate your birthday, not with applause, but with gratitude." He handed me a small box. Inside was a delicate diamond pendant shaped like a feather. "For every time you rose above cruelty," he said quietly. Tears blurred my vision. I held his hand, realizing that my story wasn't about revenge at all. It was about remembering that dignity is the one thing no one can steal, not even when they try to strip you bare in front of the world. In the following days, I began writing again, something I hadn't done in years. Words poured out of me, not about anger or pain, but about the quiet resilience that women carry when they refuse to break. Adrian encouraged me to publish them, and together we decided to turn my experience into something meaningful, a foundation for women who'd faced public shame, workplace bullying, or humiliation. I named it the Grace Within Project. And in those early meetings, as I sat across from women who carried the same kind of wounds I once hid beneath a smile, I realized that my pain had found purpose. That night at the gala no longer defined me. My calm did. My silence did. My grace did. Sometimes dignity doesn't roar. It simply stands, head held high, and lets the world see that no amount of cruelty can dim the light of a woman who knows her worth. Time has a strange way of healing, not by erasing what happened, but by turning pain into clarity. Weeks after that night, the echoes of the gala still lingered like a half-forgotten song. The tabloids had moved on to new scandals, but whispers about the birthday incident still floated around the city's elite circles. Veronica had gone silent, her company lost its contracts, her brand endorsements vanished, and the people who once clung to her for status now avoided her like she carried a curse. I never took pleasure in her downfall. In truth, I pitied her, because I had learned something she hadn't, that cruelty is its own kind of punishment. People who build their worth on tearing others down eventually crumble beneath the same weight they tried to place on others. My life, however, changed in quieter, more meaningful ways. The Grace Within project had grown faster than I expected. Letters started pouring in, stories from women across the world who had faced humiliation in boardrooms, classrooms, relationships, and public spaces. They thanked me for giving them a voice, for showing that dignity could outshine shame. Some sent small donations, others sent gratitude written in trembling handwriting. Every word felt like a balm on the wounds I once carried. Adrian stood by me through it all, not as the billionaire who rescued me, but as the man who believed in me. He attended every foundation event quietly, letting me speak, letting me lead. He no longer saw me as someone who needed protection. He saw me as his equal. And that, more than any wealth or title, was the greatest gift of all. Sometimes when I walked past the grand ballroom where it all happened, I'd pause by the window. The chandeliers still glittered above the marble floors, but they no longer reminded me of humiliation. They reminded me of transformation. I would close my eyes and hear the faint echo of laughter, the cruel kind that once broke me, and realize it no longer hurt. Because that laughter had turned into applause, not for the dress I wore or the man I married, but for the woman I became. Adrian often teased me about how that night had changed his perspective, too. "You taught me something powerful, Eleanor," he said one evening, as we watched the sun set over the ocean. "I thought power meant control. But real power is protecting peace." I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder. "And peace," I said softly, "is knowing you don't need to fight to prove your worth." That night, I finally understood something deeper than pride or revenge. Grace doesn't mean staying silent when someone hurts you. It means choosing how to rise after they try. It's not weakness. It's wisdom in motion. As I stood before a new group of women at one of our workshops, I ended my speech with the same words that had guided me through my darkest moments. Dignity is the dress that never tears, even when the world tries to rip it off you. Wear it quietly, wear it proudly, because one day the same people who laughed at your pain will stand in awe of your strength. When I finished, the room filled with applause, but it wasn't loud or chaotic. It was warm, full of understanding. I saw tears in the eyes of women who had once been broken, now standing tall, just as I had. And in that moment, I knew the story had come full circle. The night that was meant to humiliate me had become the foundation of my purpose. Veronica's cruelty had built my calling, and the woman who once trembled under the weight of shame now stood unshaken, surrounded by others finding their own strength. So if you're listening to this, if someone ever tried to make you feel small, remember this: you don't have to shout to win. You just have to keep your head high, your heart steady, and your grace intact. Because the loudest revenge is peace. If my story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity never dies. It only grows stronger with time, because in the end, grace always wins.